There are places where people tell strange stories. And then there are places where the stories become so persistent that investigators eventually begin keeping files, maps, newspaper clippings, witness accounts, and records of their own expeditions. In southeastern Massachusetts, one of those places is known as the Bridgewater Triangle. And deep inside this story is a man named Joseph DeAndrade, who said that one encounter in 1978 changed the direction of his life. The story is usually told in one sentence. Joseph DeAndrade saw Bigfoot near the Hockomock Swamp. But that description leaves out something important. DeAndrade's first reported encounter did not begin with him searching for a legendary creature. According to accounts of his experience, he was a young man who encountered something he could not identify near Clay Banks Pond in Bridgewater. Years later, he would return to the surrounding wilderness looking for answers. And that creates the real mystery. If DeAndrade already believed he had seen something unusual, why did he spend years returning to an enormous Massachusetts wetland looking for it? What exactly did he claim to have seen that winter in 1978? And when he eventually organized expeditions into the Hockomock region, did those searches produce evidence, or only more stories? Before we continue, there is one distinction that matters throughout this investigation. This is not a story about a creature that has been scientifically proven to exist. It is a story about a man's reported experience, the investigations that followed it, and the evidence that can actually be found today. The Bridgewater Public Library preserves DeAndrade's writings and related newspaper material, but explicitly says it does not endorse the claims contained in those resources. That distinction is important because the Bridgewater Triangle has accumulated decades of stories involving Bigfoot-like creatures, UFOs, strange lights, giant birds, unusual animals, ghosts, and other unexplained phenomena. The library describes the triangle as an area of roughly 200 square miles, with the Hockomock Swamp, about 16,950 acres, at the center of many of those legends. But Joseph DeAndrade's story is different from many modern internet legends. His name appears in archived newspapers and library collections. His own writings are preserved. There is even a document titled "My First Sasquatch Sighting in the Bridgewater Triangle." So instead of starting with the legend, let's start with the man who said he experienced it. Joseph DeAndrade was a lifelong resident of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. According to a later interview and documentary material about him, his first reported encounter happened in the winter of 1978 when he was 24 years old. At that time, however, he had not yet become the investigator associated with the Bridgewater Triangle. He was simply a local man who believed he had seen something extraordinary. The location was Clay Banks Pond near Bridgewater. This detail is worth emphasizing because it changes how the story should be understood. DeAndrade's first sighting is often described as a Hockomock Swamp encounter, but the sources that discuss his account identify Clay Banks Pond as the location of the initial sighting. Later, he would organize expeditions into the broader Hockomock region. According to DeAndrade's own accounts, as reported by later sources, he was standing near the pond with his back toward the water. Something prompted him to turn around, and when he did, he said he saw a large, hairy, man-like creature moving slowly down a small hill some distance away. The description is remarkably specific in some respects and limited in others. DeAndrade described the creature as very tall, covered in long, dark brown hair and weighing hundreds of pounds, but he did not get a clear look at its face. He said he was viewing the figure from behind, which meant some of the most important identifying features were simply unavailable to him. That limitation is important. A witness seeing a large figure from behind at a distance is not the same thing as a witness standing face to face with an unknown animal. There is room for uncertainty. A person's estimate of height, weight, color, and distance can also be affected by lighting, perspective, terrain, vegetation, and surprise. And yet DeAndrade said the experience left a powerful impression on him. In a later account, he described the creature as something he would never forget. Another source, quoting the 1998 coverage, says he considered himself lucky to be alive after the encounter. Whether that interpretation was justified is impossible to determine from the available evidence, but it shows how seriously he personally regarded the experience. There was another important element. DeAndrade did not immediately have a complete theory explaining what he had seen. Instead, the encounter became the beginning of a much longer search. He began collecting reports from other people who claimed to have encountered unusual creatures in the same general region. That is where the story becomes larger than one man's sighting. The name Bridgewater Triangle was not an ancient designation for the region. The boundaries of the modern paranormal concept were defined by cryptozoologist Loren Coleman, and the area subsequently became associated with a broad collection of alleged phenomena. The Bridgewater Public Library describes reports ranging from UFOs and poltergeists to Bigfoot-like sightings, giant snakes, thunderbirds, and other unusual claims. The Hockomock Swamp occupies a particularly important position within those stories. It is a vast wetland in southeastern Massachusetts, and its size and difficult terrain make it an environment where visibility can be limited and large areas can remain difficult to observe directly. That does not prove that an unknown creature lives there, but it does help explain why the swamp became such a powerful setting for stories about things people believed they had seen. For DeAndrade, the swamp became more than scenery. It became the place where he believed answers might be found. He eventually founded the Bridgewater Triangle Expedition Team in 1985. Later, in 1992, he founded the Paranormal Investigation Organization. The Bridgewater Public Library preserves documents associated with both organizations, along with DeAndrade's writings, maps, sighting charts, UFO reports, and other material connected to his investigations. That is one of the most fascinating parts of the entire case. DeAndrade did not simply tell one strange story and disappear from the subject. He spent years documenting and investigating the region. The library's collection includes a specific Hockomock Swamp report, a Sasquatch sightings in the BT chart, a huge bird sightings/Sasquatch sightings chart, and his personal account titled My First Sasquatch Sighting in the Bridgewater Triangle. So what happened when he went looking? The first thing to understand is that the expedition itself was not a scientific expedition in the conventional modern sense. DeAndrade and his colleagues were searching for something they believed might exist based largely on reported sightings. Their work belongs to the history of local paranormal and cryptozoological investigation rather than to a controlled biological research program. That distinction doesn't make the stories meaningless. It simply tells us what kind of evidence we are dealing with. A newspaper clipping from the late 1990s describes DeAndrade and members of his expedition team entering the swamp area equipped with cameras and other equipment. The team hoped to encounter the creature again, but despite their efforts, they did not obtain a universally accepted photograph or physical specimen proving that a Bigfoot-like animal lived there. And that creates a fascinating contradiction. If DeAndrade had seen something he believed was a large, hairy creature, you might expect repeated expeditions to eventually produce something more substantial: a footprint, hair with a verified biological origin, clear photographs, biological samples, or perhaps a body. Instead, the evidence remained frustratingly elusive. The team continued searching. They heard strange noises, they investigated reports, they looked for signs, they returned to areas where other people claimed to have seen something unusual, but the creature itself remained outside their grasp. This is a recurring problem in Bigfoot investigations everywhere. A witness can be completely sincere and still be mistaken about what they saw. At the same time, the absence of a definitive specimen does not tell us what every individual witness actually experienced. Those are two different questions. Did Joseph DeAndrade sincerely believe he saw a large, hairy creature? The available material strongly indicates that he did. Did that prove the existence of an unknown primate in Massachusetts? No. And that distinction is exactly where this story becomes more interesting. Let's return to that winter day in 1978. The figure DeAndrade described was not presented as a monster with supernatural powers. In the accounts available, it was fundamentally a physical figure, tall, large, dark-haired, and human-like in shape. It was moving slowly through the landscape. DeAndrade watched it from a distance, and because he saw it from behind, he could not clearly identify its face. That description leaves several possibilities open. One possibility is that DeAndrade genuinely encountered an unknown animal. Another is that he saw a known animal under unusual conditions and interpreted its shape as something else. A third is that distance, lighting, vegetation, movement, and expectation combined to create an inaccurate impression. And there is another possibility that is often overlooked. The witness may accurately remember the experience while still being unable to accurately identify what caused it. Those are not contradictory statements. Human perception is designed to make rapid judgments from incomplete information. In a forest, especially in winter light, the brain can recognize a silhouette before it has enough information to identify the object producing it. If that silhouette is unusually tall, dark, or moving in an unexpected way, the experience can become unforgettable without necessarily providing enough evidence for a definitive identification. DeAndrade's description of the creature's size also illustrates the problem. Estimates such as 6 feet, 7 feet, or even larger are difficult for a person to make accurately when the distance is uncertain. A familiar object nearby can make something farther away appear smaller, while terrain can produce the opposite effect. And yet there is one reason his account remains compelling as a historical mystery. He did not claim to have seen something that was completely impossible in outline. He claimed to have seen a large, hairy, human-like figure. That is strange, but it is not automatically supernatural. DeAndrade's later investigations were influenced by reports from other people. Some of those stories were considerably stranger than his own. One account describes a person who reportedly saw a tall, dark-haired bipedal creature in a garden at night. The creature was allegedly holding a pumpkin, looked toward the witness with reddish-orange eyes, and then ran into the woods. Another story attributed to the region involves a local man named John Baker, who reportedly encountered a large, hairy creature while canoeing in the swamp. According to the account, Baker heard a splash and then saw what he described as a hairy beast moving through the water near his boat. Again, these are reports, not confirmed observations, but they reveal why the Hockomock Swamp became such an important location in the local Bigfoot tradition. The stories were not all identical. Some described creatures on land, others involved the water. Some focused on movement, others focused on sounds, footprints, or brief glimpses. And when many stories begin circulating around the same geographic area, people naturally start looking for a connection. That is how a collection of isolated encounters can become a legend. But there is another question. Could some of these sightings have involved ordinary wildlife? Massachusetts is not a place without large mammals. Black bears live in the state, and deer are common. Moose also occur in Massachusetts, although they are far less common in southeastern Massachusetts than in western and central parts of the state. A large animal moving through dense vegetation can look dramatically different depending on how much of its body is visible. One local analysis of Hockomock reports proposed that some alleged Bigfoot observations could potentially involve a moose or bear. The author pointed out that the swamp is extensive and that large mammals can remain difficult to observe in such an environment. That doesn't prove DeAndrade saw a bear or moose. In fact, there is a significant difference between saying a bear could explain this and saying it was definitely a bear. The first is a hypothesis, the second would require evidence, and this is where a good investigation should stop itself from going too far. If we take every unexplained sighting and immediately declare it Bigfoot, we are no longer investigating. We are simply confirming the conclusion we started with. But if we take every strange sighting and automatically dismiss it as a bear, we make the opposite mistake. The more honest position is that the available evidence does not allow us to identify DeAndrade's 1978 sighting with certainty, and perhaps that is why the story survived. DeAndrade's decision to continue investigating is what transformed a personal encounter into a larger part of Bridgewater Triangle history. In 1985, he founded the Bridgewater Triangle Expedition Team. According to archival accounts, the group included other people interested in investigating reports from the region. Their goal was simple in concept: go into the area, search for evidence, find the creature. But the reality was much more complicated. A creature that is rarely seen is difficult to investigate. A swamp is difficult to search, and a report from a witness can point investigators toward a location, but it cannot guarantee that the same event will happen again. This is especially true when the alleged creature itself is never conclusively identified. The team returned to the region repeatedly. According to historical accounts, they used cameras and other equipment and attempted to locate evidence of the creature. But the search never produced the kind of discovery that would settle the question for everyone. Instead, the investigations generated another layer of stories: strange sounds, possible tracks, reports from other witnesses, unexpected encounters, and eventually experiences that changed DeAndrade's own interpretation of the swamp. One account from the historical record says that DeAndrade eventually became convinced that the Hockomock Swamp contained something more than simply an elusive animal. A researcher who examined the old Bridgewater Triangle files wrote that DeAndrade eventually disbanded the expedition team after what he described as a terrifying experience involving what he believed were evil spirits. This is a major turning point. At the beginning, the question was biological. What was that creature? Could it be Bigfoot? Could it be an unknown animal? But after years of investigation, the mystery began moving into another category. Was the swamp itself responsible for strange experiences? Were witnesses encountering something paranormal? Or had years of expectation and repeated exposure to stories changed the way investigators interpreted ambiguous events? We cannot answer that from the available material. What we can say is that DeAndrade's own interests expanded dramatically. His preserved writings include material on UFOs, paranormal investigations, Sasquatch sightings, unusual creatures, and other subjects connected with the triangle. The man who had once been a witness became an investigator, and the investigator eventually became one of the principal people associated with the legend. This is where we need to slow down. The existence of Joseph DeAndrade is documented. His organizations are documented. His writings are preserved. The newspapers that reported on his investigations are documented as a claim. But the creature itself has never been scientifically confirmed. That difference is enormous. The Bridgewater Public Library itself makes this distinction clear. It hosts the DeAndrade materials because they are part of the area's history and archival record, but it specifically states that the library does not endorse the claims contained in those resources. That makes the library's collection particularly useful for an investigation like this. We don't have to pretend the evidence is stronger than it is. We can simply ask what the records tell us. And the records tell us that Joseph DeAndrade reported an extraordinary encounter in 1978 and subsequently devoted decades to investigating similar reports. They also tell us that other people reported unusual creatures in the same general region. What the records do not give us is the final piece of the puzzle. There is no universally accepted specimen. There is no scientifically verified DNA sample from a Bridgewater Bigfoot. There is no clear photograph that has established the existence of an unknown primate living in the Hockomock Swamp. There is no body. And that is precisely why the mystery remains a mystery. There is another reason DeAndrade's story remains fascinating even if someone approaches it as a skeptic. He continued talking about the encounter decades later. In 2024, the Boston Globe reported on Bigfoot enthusiasts and skeptics and included DeAndrade among people associated with expeditions into the Hockomock Swamp. The article says he recalled 2 encounters of his own in late 1978. Think about what that means. An event that allegedly lasted only moments became something that remained part of his identity for decades. That does not prove that his interpretation was correct, but it tells us something about the psychological power of unexplained experiences. When a person sees something that cannot identify, the mind does not necessarily close the case when the event ends. Sometimes the opposite happens. The unanswered question becomes the most memorable part. What was it? Why was it there? Could it still be there? Did someone else see it? Could it happen again? And if another witness reports something similar years later, the original memory suddenly feels less isolated. That is one of the mechanisms by which legends grow, but it is also one of the reasons genuine mysteries can be difficult to investigate. So, what did Joseph DeAndrade actually see? There are several possibilities. Perhaps he saw an unknown creature. Perhaps he saw a known animal under unusual conditions. Perhaps the distance and environment distorted his perception. Perhaps there is information about the encounter that has not survived in the available records. Or perhaps the event was exactly as he remembered it, but the thing he saw remains unidentified. None of those possibilities can currently be proven. And there is something intellectually valuable about leaving the final question open, because the goal of an investigation should not be to manufacture certainty where the evidence does not provide it. The goal should be to understand what happened as far as the evidence allows. In DeAndrade's case, the strongest conclusion is not Bigfoot lives in Massachusetts. The strongest conclusion is simpler. A Bridgewater resident named Joseph DeAndrade reported seeing a large, hairy, human-like figure in 1978, and that experience led him to spend decades investigating similar reports in the Bridgewater Triangle. His work became part of the area's documented folklore and paranormal history. Everything beyond that remains a question. And perhaps the setting is part of why the story refuses to disappear. The Hockomock Swamp is enormous. It covers thousands of acres, and the landscape includes wetlands, woods, water, dense vegetation, and difficult terrain. The Bridgewater Public Library identifies it as the largest freshwater swamp in Massachusetts and says that it has long been associated with stories connected to the Bridgewater Triangle.
That is one of the most fascinating parts of the entire case. DeAndrade did not simply tell one strange story and disappear from the subject. He spent years documenting and investigating the region. The library's collection includes a specific Hockomock Swamp report, a Sasquatch sightings in the BT chart, a huge bird sightings/Sasquatch sightings chart, and his personal account titled My First Sasquatch Sighting in the Bridgewater Triangle. So what happened when he went looking? The first thing to understand is that the expedition itself was not a scientific expedition in the conventional modern sense. DeAndrade and his colleagues were searching for something they believed might exist, based largely on reported sightings. Their work belongs to the history of local paranormal and cryptozoological investigation, rather than to a controlled biological research program. That distinction doesn't make the stories meaningless. It simply tells us what kind of evidence we are dealing with. A newspaper clipping from the late 1990s describes DeAndrade and members of his expedition team entering the swamp area equipped with cameras and other equipment. The team hoped to encounter the creature again. But despite their efforts, they did not obtain a universally accepted photograph or physical specimen proving that a Bigfoot-like animal lived there. And that creates a fascinating contradiction. If DeAndrade had seen something he believed was a large, hairy creature, you might expect repeated expeditions to eventually produce something more substantial. A footprint, hair with a verified biological origin, clear photographs, biological samples, or perhaps a body. Instead, the evidence remained frustratingly elusive. The team continued searching. They heard strange noises. They investigated reports. They looked for signs. They returned to areas where other people claimed to have seen something unusual. But the creature itself remained outside their grasp. This is a recurring problem in Bigfoot investigations everywhere. A witness can be completely sincere and still be mistaken about what they saw. At the same time, the absence of a definitive specimen does not tell us what every individual witness actually experienced. Those are two different questions. Did Joseph DeAndrade sincerely believe he saw a large, hairy creature? The available material strongly indicates that he did. Did that prove the existence of an unknown primate in Massachusetts? No. And that distinction is exactly where this story becomes more interesting. Let's return to that winter day in 1978. The figure DeAndrade described was not presented as a monster with supernatural powers. In the accounts available, it was fundamentally a physical figure, tall, large, dark-haired, and human-like in shape. It was moving slowly through the landscape. DeAndrade watched it from a distance, and because he saw it from behind, he could not clearly identify its face. That description leaves several possibilities open. One possibility is that DeAndrade genuinely encountered an unknown animal. Another is that he saw a known animal under unusual conditions and interpreted its shape as something else. A third is that distance, lighting, vegetation, movement, and expectation combined to create an inaccurate impression. And there is another possibility that is often overlooked. The witness may accurately remember the experience while still being unable to accurately identify what caused it. Those are not contradictory statements.
Imagine standing near the edge of that landscape in winter. The temperature is low, the trees are dark, the water and vegetation interrupt your view. Every distant movement becomes difficult to identify. A branch breaks somewhere beyond your field of vision. Something moves behind the trees. You turn. For 1 second, you see a shape. Tall, dark, moving away. Then it disappears. What did you see? A person? A bear? A moose? A trick of perspective? Or something nobody has identified? That is the question DeAndrade's story leaves behind. The Bridgewater Triangle contains many legends, but DeAndrade's story is particularly useful because it has a traceable human history. We can follow the timeline. 1978, the reported encounter. 1985, DeAndrade establishes the Bridgewater Triangle Expedition Team. 1989, he produces a written Hockomock Swamp report. 1990, a map of the Bridgewater Triangle appears in his preserved materials. 1991, he documents a UFO sighting. 1992, he establishes the Paranormal Investigation Organization. Later, newspapers continue covering his investigations and his claims about the region. That doesn't turn the claims into scientific evidence, but it gives us something valuable, a paper trail. And when investigating mysteries, a paper trail is often more interesting than a dramatic story, because it allows us to ask not only what did the witness claim, but also when did he claim it, who reported it, what records remain, did investigators find anything, and perhaps most importantly, what can we confidently say today? Joseph DeAndrade went looking for answers because he believed he had already seen something he couldn't explain. He didn't have a laboratory. He didn't have a university research team. He didn't have a verified specimen. He had an experience. And instead of forgetting it, he spent decades trying to understand it. That is what makes his story worth investigating. Not because it proves Bigfoot exists, not because every story from the Bridgewater Triangle must be true, but because somewhere between belief and skepticism, there is a genuine historical question. What did a 24-year-old man actually see near Claybanks Pond in the winter of 1978? And why did that single moment become important enough for him to spend the rest of his life searching the surrounding wilderness for answers? We may never know, but the search itself left a trail. Newspaper articles, investigation reports, personal writings, maps, sightings collected from other witnesses, an enormous swamp that continues to occupy a strange place in Massachusetts folklore. Perhaps one day someone will produce undeniable evidence of an unknown animal living in the region. Perhaps future research will demonstrate that every famous sighting had a conventional explanation. Or perhaps the truth will remain somewhere between those two possibilities. For now, Joseph DeAndrade's encounter remains exactly what the evidence allows us to call it, an unexplained personal report. And sometimes that is where the most interesting investigations begin. Because the question isn't simply whether Bigfoot was standing in the woods that winter. The question is, what exactly was standing there? And why did Joseph DeAndrade never stop looking for it? If you enjoy investigations into the unexplained where we separate documented history from witness testimony and legend, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't assume that every strange story is true, and we don't assume that every strange story has already been explained. The Bridgewater Triangle contains decades of reports involving unusual creatures, strange lights, UFOs, paranormal experiences, and other unexplained encounters. In future investigations, we'll examine those stories one at a time and follow the evidence as far as it takes us. And if you were standing near the Hockomock Swamp in 1978 with something large and unfamiliar disappearing into the trees, what would you have believed you had seen? Maybe a bear, maybe something else, or maybe the same question Joseph DeAndrade carried with him for decades. What was it?